Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us in our author interview series. Today, we're talking with author John Wood, and we're going to talk about his book, Railroads Through the Coeur d'Alenes, and then he's going to introduce us to his upcoming book about the steamboat industry. So, John, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what is your background connected to, of course, the Coeur d'Alene area, but also the railroad industry?
I was not born in Coeur d'Alene, happened to be born in Spokane, but that was more of a, I don't know if I'd call it an accident or whatever. My parents always lived in Coeur d'Alene, and I grew up in Coeur d'Alene, graduated from Coeur d'Alene High School. My great-grandparents came to Coeur d'Alene either 1889 or 1890, and that was my father's mother's parents. Their name was Thompson, and there is a house on Sherman Avenue, the Thompson House at 1028 Sherman, and that was the house that my great-grandfather, George Thompson, built, and it's still there. And Robert Singletary, connected with the museum, owned that for a number of years. So anyway, so I've got the history with Coeur d'Alene. My folks lived in Coeur d'Alene. I lived there up until I graduated from college, got married, and moved down here to Oregon. But Coeur d'Alene's always been my hometown and always had an interest in it. As far as railroads, I got a Lionel train set when I was, for Christmas one year when I was a little kid. I think in the beginning my father played with it more than I did, but I ended up falling in love with railroads through model trains, and had interest in it when I was in college, but it wasn't nearly as fun in college writing research papers about historical subjects than it was after I got out. After I got out, I ran across a photograph that of the narrow gauge railroad up in the Coeur d'Alene mining area, the Coeur d'Alene Railway and Navigation Company, and I'd never seen it before. And I don't even know if I'd ever even heard the name of the railroad. And the fellow who had it in a book said it was the only photo he had seen of it in all his years of looking, and that was about 30 years worth. And it got me wondering, gosh, there should be more out there. I started looking, and within a matter of a few months, I found 10 or 15 photographs, and I thought this would make a real neat subject for a book. But no one's ever going to write a book on it. Why don't I try? You know, I didn't really expect that it would ever come to anything, but it did. And so away we went. It was actually, I find more enjoyment doing the research, looking for things, than I do the actual writing. Writing can be a chore at times, but the research is fun. It's a treasure hunt. And I know Debbie's gone on that treasure hunt with me from time to time. So anyway, that's kind of how I got into the railroads and into the subject of the railroads up in the Coeur d'Alene mining area. There were some people connected with the family that were somewhat involved with railroading. There was an engineer for the Milwaukee Railroad that came into Coeur d'Alene. That one summer when I was little, my dad took me down there, and the diesel engine was sitting down where the Coeur d'Alene Hotel is now, part of the greenery and flower beds and that sort of thing. And his locomotive was sitting there. I don't know if he had lunch at Templin's there or what at the time. And he offered to have me get up and go for a ride in the locomotive. And at the time, I was pretty young and I was scared to death. But we went for a little ride. So anyway.
Nice.
Anyway, that's part of that. That's kind of where I got into railroads. And the interest in steamboats. So there were a number of connections between the railroads and the steamboats back in that era, and a lot of people don't realize how much the two had a symbiotic relationship, really. And so when I was doing the research and writing on the railroads, I included a little bit about those interfaces between the two. If it hadn't been for the electric line coming into Coeur d'Alene, the steamboats probably would not have ever reached the number that they did. So that was one of the big things. The narrow gauge couldn't have existed without a connection with steamboats because there was no physical railroad connection from the Coeur d'Alene mining area. The narrow gauge came down to the old Mission landing, and they had to have steamboats to bring the ore from there on down to Coeur d'Alene, where there was another branch railroad, the Northern Pacific, that picked up the ore. So there was an interface between the two there. It's amazing how many major railroads really served the little town of Coeur d'Alene City. To begin with, it was the Northern Pacific that came into town, and that was back in about 1886, 87. And then after the narrow gauge, or that railroad came into town, the Northern Pacific, the next one after that was the electric line. And the electric line was an independent, F.A. Blackwell, who had a house on Sherman Avenue that my grandparents later owned, that's now gone, unfortunately. 817 Sherman. Anyway, Blackwell was the president of the electric line, and that made a connection with the steamboats that were going up the lake to Harrison, and people could ride from Coeur d'Alene to Harrison and pick up the standard gauge Oregon Railway and Navigation Company and go on up to the mining area. The third railroad that came into Coeur d'Alene, if I can get my order correct here, was the Milwaukee, and then after that was the Spokane International. So there were four major railroads that came into Coeur d'Alene, which I think is amazing for the small size of the town.
And had a lot to do with the town population growth during that time.
Absolutely.
Because
and I think, go ahead.
I was going to say the popular statistic in 1903, Coeur d'Alene had 500 people, and in 1910 they had 7,000 people. I mean, when we talk about population growth, it's not even the growth that we complain about today. It is not.
Right.
It doesn't compare.
And to me, the public transportation back then, the service, the electric line between Coeur d'Alene and in Spokane, I think at one time they had like 6 or 7 trains a day that were going back and forth. You could go between those 2 points on the train, and today, unfortunately, public transportation in most areas in the West is pretty meager. Even a lot of the passenger trains no longer exist. There was an Amtrak train that used to go from Portland to Boise and to Salt Lake City, and that's a Pioneer. That's long gone. I have ridden the Amtrak that goes from Portland up the gorge to Spokane. I've ridden that a number of times. That's still there, fortunately. But I don't know. The current climate is not very good for the government funding of railroads. And to really exist in the West out here, it's going to be something it's going to require some public funding, or it can't exist.
Now, your railroad book, we've published the revised edition. So what were the changes from the first to the second?
It's funny, if you put the two next to each other, the original book is much thicker, but it has far fewer pages. I think it has maybe 100 less pages. Caxton printers published the first edition, and they used a very thick, I hate to say it, cheap paper, and the photo reproduction wasn't nearly as good, but it made a nice fat book, and it looked like it was really huge compared to the new one, but the new one has got way more pages. It has way more photographs. The additional photographs that are in the revised edition, I probably had double or triple that number of photographs I could have put in it if there had been room. I could have talked Dorothy into adding more to it, but
Well,
it's an improvement over the old one by far.
There's 400 photograph, or over 400, I should say, and some of them I believe were not seen before.
Right.
And they include photographs taken by well-known rail photographers.
I had the fortune of meeting one fellow who was quite a photographer, Ron Nixon. He had been a telegrapher for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and he went around as he worked at various telegraph depots on the Northern Pacific taking photos, and not just where he was working. He actually traveled on the railroad intentionally to just take photos. He was an official, at one point, photographer for the Northern Pacific, and a lot of his photographs ended up in the magazines for the Northern Pacific Railroad. But I managed to meet Ron and corresponded with him for a long time, and he was living up in Polson, Montana, and I went up and talked to him up in Polson. I don't remember, it was probably 4 or 5 years after I met him that he passed, but anyway, really quite a guy. Another fellow with the Northern Pacific that had a lot of photographs was Warren McGee. Warren was a conductor on the Northern Pacific, and Ron was very quiet, not an outgoing person, and Warren McGee was just the opposite. He would tell you exactly what he thought about the management of the Northern Pacific Railroad. And he was quite a character. He came down here where I lived in Oregon country, and not too far from here, and did several slideshows that were, anyway, he was a guy to listen to. He was quite a character.
Well, speaking of I'm sorry.
Oh, I forgot the biggest one, and that is T.N. Barnard, and I mispronounce his name all the time. I pronounce it Bernard, and it's Barnard. But anyway, the Barnard Stockbridge collection at the University of Idaho, I think my book probably had more of their photos than any other book. And I don't know if any of the books have come out with more of their stuff in one volume yet or not, but really quite a collection. I've had people tell me that the collection is all available online, but that's not true. There's just a small portion of that collection that you can look at on the internet, at least that I've been able to find. And just unbelievably amazing, beautiful photos. Anyway, I at one time I thought when I did the first book that I had gone through the complete collection, and I didn't find out until after my book came out. There was a photograph that I had not seen, and I thought I saw everything in the collection. I was told that that was it. And the person in the special collections department said, oh, there are a few other things that haven't been printed yet, but they're just portraits of people, not scenic views or anything like that. And I found out that wasn't true. There were thousands that hadn't been printed yet. And I was able to include some of the new ones that weren't in the old book because they hadn't, there hadn't been hard copies of them that were available at the time.
Nice. Now, can you describe to me the competition between the rail companies, since you mentioned the management at Union Pacific? Well,
the first railroad that was in the Coeur d'Alene mining area was the narrow gauge Coeur d'Alene Railway and Navigation Company, and D.C. Corbin, who was the instrumental in getting those built, or getting that built, there had to be a connection from the old Mission Landing because the narrow gauge couldn't cross the lake. And it was easier to cross the lake in a steamer than it was to build through some of the mountains that they would have had to have gone through in order to get to Coeur d'Alene. So they used the steamboats from the old Mission Landing to Coeur d'Alene, and then there was a standard gauge Northern Pacific branch that was built from Hauser Junction into Coeur d'Alene. So that was the first rail and water connection to the Coeur d'Alene mining area. And then the OR&N, actually they had a paper company called the Washington and Idaho that never had any equipment that built the line, but it really was behind, OR&N was behind that. And that built from Spokane, they had a line from Spokane to Tico, Washington, and then from Tico back up toward the Coeur d'Alene country. And that's the line that goes past Chat-Colette, goes from Plummer, down the hill from Plummer, down to Chat-Colette, and then across the St. Joe River. And you had, before we got started here, mentioned something about things that are still left that are visible on the trail of the Coeur d'Alenes. Well, of course, the swing bridge there is one of the things that's left, although certainly not in the position it was originally. It's jacked up very high in order to be able to clear larger boats that might go up the St. Joe River. St. Joe River is considered a navigable river, and you can't block the navigation of larger boats on it, so they couldn't have just left the swing bridge there at the original level and locked it in place, because some boats were too tall to get under it, and that's why they had to jack it up. But the swing bridge now doesn't swing anymore, but bicyclists and walkers can certainly go over it. The line then went on up along Coeur d'Alene Lake and up to Harrison, and then up the Coeur d'Alene River Valley up to the mining area. When that line got completed, the narrow gauge really wasn't a viable option anymore because it was too expensive to transfer sacks of ore from the narrow gauge onto the boats, ship it to Coeur d'Alene, take them off the boats, load them onto railroad cars and send them out. The narrow gauge lasted for a few years after that, but it was just a vestige of what it had once been. And the OR&N really took over the main part of the shipping. The Northern Pacific, in order to counter that, built their line from Missoula, Montana to St. Regis, from St. Regis up the St. Regis to Borgia River, and over Lookout Pass and down into the mining area. So that way the two were still in competition after the Northern Pacific built that line. And that line really was part of what fascinated me, that the big, huge trestles they had up there, those trestles were still there when I was a kid, and you could go up and watch them. The trains run on them. The most spectacular was the what they called the S bridge. It was actually a trestle, but they called it a bridge, and that's on the front cover of the revised book, the S bridge.
Oh yeah.
So those two lines competed with each other. They both built branches from Wallace up to Burke, Idaho, up Canyon Creek, and so they had competition going up Canyon Creek up to up to Burke. But as far as competing in the Coeur d'Alene Valley, those were the two railroads. There was competition with other railroads in a different way, and part of that had to do with excursion traffic on the Lake Coeur d'Alene and on the rivers. The Milwaukee Railroad, when it was completed through the St. Joe Valley, they had a side trip set up where passengers could get off at St. Mary's and get on a steamboat, go down the St. Joe River and across the lake to Coeur d'Alene. and there take a train into Spokane and pick up the Milwaukee again. So that was, there was competition in that sense with some of the other railroads.
Now, is it true that their tracks were built so close together that they could almost touch each other?
Up through Burke, yes, it was pretty close. Didn't last very long that way. They finally, I mean, they realized pretty early on that having that kind of duplication of track was sort of crazy. They ended up getting some joint track agreements, and it ended up that there was just one track through Burke for quite a while. And there was a fire in Burke in 1923, and it burned down much of the town, burned down both the Union Pacific and the Northern Pacific depots. And so they built one depot. In this case, it was the Union Pacific, or OWRN, and the Union Pacific allowed the Northern Pacific trains to use their depot. So again, it was a kind of a joint agreement. Finally, in 1948, the Northern Pacific abandoned their trackage up to Burke altogether. So there was just one railroad line up there, but they had an agreement where both could use the same track.
Smarter.
So they did get a point, yeah. I love Burke, but there's not much left up there. Speaking of, what's left of things today, in Burke, not much of anything. Of course, in Wallace, the Northern Pacific Depot's still there. Unfortunately, when they put the freeway through up on the hillside, they had to move the Northern Pacific Depot, and they had to get rid of the Union Pacific Depot or move it, and the community couldn't raise enough money to save both of them. So the Union Pacific Depot was torn down, and the Northern Pacific Depot was moved. But it's a gorgeous depot, and if you haven't gone up to see it restored, you should go up there. There is still the Union Pacific Depot in Kellogg. And there actually is a freight house in Kellogg. The Union Pacific Depot that's there is a brick depot, but there's a freight house there that a bicycle company either owned or leased and rented bicycles there. That depot probably is the original wooden Union Pacific Depot, or an N depot, that was turned into a freight depot, and then it's amazing to me it's still there.
Yeah.
Don't know of any other depots that exist up there. I think the depot in Harrison is long gone. I can't think of any others that might be there. So as far as artifacts of what's there, certainly the trestles up over Lookout Pass are all gone. However, a lot of people don't realize it, but the roadbed of the Northern Pacific Railroad over Lookout Pass is still there. You can take the trail of the Coeur d'Alenes, which is the Union Pacific line, from Plummer. I think people can go by bike from Plummer all the way up to Kellogg and possibly beyond. I'm not sure what happened with a Superfund site there that they had to tear up the original roadbed, but you can get past that. But you can go from Kellogg up to Wallace. From Wallace, the roadbed for the Northern Pacific, you can get on that again at Shoshone Park, which is just to the east of Mullen. If you go up to Shoshone Park, you can get on to the old roadbed that goes up over Lookout. No track or ties anymore, but I think bicyclists can still use it. It's not nearly as well known or used as the trail of the Hiawatha. And you can go up to Lookout Pass and get on it and go from there down into Montana. And I'm not sure exactly how far. You get pretty close to where the tunnel is for the Milwaukee, the St. Paul Tunnel. So you could conceivably make a big giant loop. If you took the Milwaukee trail to the Hiawatha, go through the St. Paul Tunnel, go on down the St. Joe Valley. The Trail of the Hiawatha, I don't think most people go very far on that. They get rides back. But you can go all the way, I think, to Plummer on that. So you could conceivably make a loop from Plummer up the Coeur d'Alene River, up over Lookout Pass, down the St. Joe Valley, and back to Plummer. One big giant loop. I'm sure parts of it are not really great, but it's, the original roadbed is there.
Now, you mentioned that railroads and the steamboats have a connection, and you've got a new book forthcoming. Do you want to give us a glimpse into your pet project?
I started, while I was doing research on railroads, and that probably began, about 1975. And the first railroad book came out in '83. I picked up some steamboat stuff along the way just because of my family's involvement in Coeur d'Alene. And then in 1983, when the other book came out, I decided that I would do a book on steamboats because as a kid, I read Ruby Holt's book, Steamboats in the Timber, and I was real fascinated with it. But there weren't very many photographs, and I love old photographs, so I thought there really should be more photographs published. I wanted more information about some of the little boats on the lake, and so I started looking in 1983, making a serious effort at it, and I've been working at it ever since. I had no idea what I was getting into at all. I now have the names of probably 200 steamboats that ran on the waters of Coeur d'Alene and the rivers. Some of those are renamings of old boats, but there are many boats that didn't even have names, and we'll probably never know their names. Just unbelievable number of boats, and I think Ruby Holt said something on the order that there were more steamboats on Coeur d'Alene Lake than any freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. Now, that's probably true. I don't know that there's any way to prove it. Certainly not counting the Great Lakes, but and if you got into Puget Sound, it would be a different story. But that's over on the coast. But as far as inland waters, I'm sure there were more boats in Coeur d'Alene waters than anywhere else. Huge numbers. Coeur d'Alene really has a strange geological fixture of where it is. Coeur d'Alene is not a glacial lake, although there are people that talk about it as being a glacial lake. When I think of a glacial lake, I think of a valley that a glacier has actually been in the valley, scouring out the bottom of the valley, and that water forms in it where that glacier was. There was never any glacier, to my knowledge, that I've ever read about or heard of where Coeur d'Alene Lake is. But what happened is the outwash from the Lake Missoula came down and dammed up at the Rathdrum Prairie, came down that outwash and dammed up the end of the valley where Coeur d'Alene is now. That's part of the outwash from the glaciers, and it dammed up the water in the valley. That backed the water up that would have been a river. It backed that water up, and it caused, to me, what I think is really unusual, and that is the St. Joe River Valley and the lower part of the Coeur d'Alene River Valley are what are like old streams. They have meandering, all these turns in them, but if you get on the upper part where the water flows faster, it's a totally different situation. But the fact that they are meandering streams and the water has been slowed down because of the dammed up lake, you have the ability to navigate up those rivers, and I've heard it said that they are the highest navigable rivers in the world. As far as I can tell, I have a written thing from a world atlas that makes that statement. Now, I haven't been all over the world to investigate for sure, but there is at least one world atlas that says that's true.
Awesome. I did not know that.
Well, at one time they said that the swing bridge at Chatcolet was the highest swing bridge in the world. I found evidence that there isn't here in the state that I'm living in now, in Oregon. There is a movable span bridge that's on the upper Klamath River or lake that is higher, but it's not a swing bridge and it's not on a river. So as far as rivers go, and in fact it's a swing bridge, it was the highest swing bridge until excuse me, until they put a swing bridge in at St. Mary's. And I think a lot of people forget that there was a swing bridge at St. Mary's. That wasn't a railroad bridge. And that lasted, I went with my parents up the St. Joe time after time. But by the time I did that, the swing bridge was gone, but it lasted up until 1954, till the current bridge that's there was put in, the concrete bridge. There was a swing bridge at St. Mary's.
Nice. Now, I know a book is never done, but do you have a deadline that is forthcoming?
I've had a deadline for years. Dorothy Dahlgren has been faithfully encouraging me, and I'm amazed that she hasn't given up long ago. I'm at the point now where I haven't finished all the writing, but the majority of it's done. I'm not sure what we're going to do with it because I have what I have right now is single-spaced, small type, and I've got 430 pages with no illustrations included in it. So what it's going to end up like in the end, either we're going to probably have to cut stuff out or I'll have to twist her arm about doing 2 volumes. I'm not sure. We'll see. But anyway, I am inserting illustration, the place markers for illustrations in the text now. And I am getting the illustrations where they're supposed to go. I think a lot of people don't realize after a book is written, the actual text is written, how long it takes, if it has illustrations, a lot of illustrations, how long it takes from that point to actually get it done and out in print. But I'm trying to get at least the illustrations in where they're going to go and what ones are going to be there. So that's kind of what I'm working at the moment. So when it gets to Dorothy's desk, hopefully it'll be done.
Well, that kind of wraps up my questions, and I'm going to go ahead and open it up for everyone that's on the call if they have any questions. I don't see anything in the chat.
Jocelyn, I have
a
question.
Oh, wonderful.
First of all, John, I wanted to thank you for doing this. This has just been fascinating, and I've been a big fan of yours for a long time. I love your talks, and I've got your book in my library, and I just really appreciate everything you've done. And you mentioned your grandparents lived at 11th, your great-grandparents rather lived at 11th and Sherman. And I've been curious at that period of time of the development along that east side of Sherman. Do you know why some of the prominent citizens in Coeur d'Alene at that time built in that area? Was it just because it was close to downtown, or was there something special about that area?
I have no idea, other than the fact that it was on Sherman Avenue and that was the main street in town. I'm trying to remember. I think my great-grandfather, George Thompson, probably built that house about 1905, somewhere around there. I had the blueprints of the house and donated them to the museum last year, finally. Robert Singletary owned the house at one point, and I don't think he realized the architect for that house was George Williams, who was a fairly well-known architect in Coeur d'Alene. But anyway, his name's on the blueprints.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I've just been reading some recently some stories about the old city hall downtown, and came across George Williams' name as an architect that designed several of the buildings downtown. So.
Oops, I'd like to take a moment just to share our screen here so everyone can see your book. This is the museum's newly designed website, and you can pick up your copy of Railroads Through the Coeur d'Alene at museumni.org. And as soon as we have a pre-sale for the Steamboat book, we will definitely be putting that out. We'll get that link right on there.
Great. Thanks, Jocelyn.
Yes, thank you. It's a hardcover book. There's over 400 photographs. If you're a rail enthusiast, this is your book. And then I want to thank you, John, for joining me today and being willing to learn a new technology.
Well, I'm not doing much other than getting on. I'm sitting here talking to you. So I have done this once or twice before. We have granddaughters who wanted to do Skype. So I have done Skype, but that's not happened in a long time. So again, this is kind of unfamiliar territory.
I'm going to go ahead and, let's see, stop the